I'd like to begin. I have laryngitis. I'm going to tell you in advance, so it doesn't hurt. I just sound bad. I'd like to begin tonight with the following land acknowledgement. I am a grateful but uninvited visitor to the ancestral homelands of the Coast Salish people, past and present, including the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations, and the Duwamish peoples. I acknowledge the land on which I live, learn, and practice as Coast Salish land, and I recognize that this land acknowledgement to be one small act in an ongoing process of understanding and opposing the systematic oppression and historic and contemporary erasure of indigeneity and indigenous peoples. We are on stolen land. Good evening. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Yvette Moy. Thanks for that applause. I appreciate it. And I want to welcome you. Tonight, we have the pleasure of welcoming back one of the University of Washington's former faculty members, Dr. Jacob Grumbach. I know. He is going to be talking about American government and the 2024 election. Light subject matter. So we have more election-related events that will happen in January. So be sure to check our socials to stay abreast of all those things that are happening. I want to thank a few people. I'll start with you. You came out, you showed up, and you're spending the evening with us, and we're so grateful. We really appreciate you being here. I also want to thank the folks who are joining us on live stream. Hello out there. We're so glad that you're joining us as well. I want to acknowledge the members of the University of Washington Alumni Association who also came out this evening. And I want to welcome back our next generation leaders from the Evans School. Are you guys here tonight? Are they here? Where are you? Yeah, there you are. It's okay, you can applaud. Hold on. We have a few housekeeping items to go through this evening. And the first one is, please turn off your cell phones if you haven't done that already. We ask that you refrain from taking any personal video or audio recordings of this evening's lecture. We are live streaming it and we are recording it, and the recording should be available on our YouTube channel about 48 hours post-event. We ask that you not take photos while our speaker is on stage. And this evening, you will see a QR code that will come up, and that's our Slido. You can scan that QR code and submit a question. You can upvote a question if you want. We also have microphones right over here, stage right, where you can walk up and you can ask a question, provided it is in the form of a question. I know. And before I jump into Dr. Grumbach's introduction, I want to invite you to take a minute to introduce yourself to the people sitting next to you and say hello. Oh. All right, you guys. Tonight, we are excited to welcome back Dr. Jacob Grumbach. Currently, Dr. Grumbach is an associate professor at the Goldman School of Public Policy at UC Berkeley. He was previously an associate professor of political science at the University of Washington and a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for the Study of Democratic Politics at Princeton. Dr. Grumbach studies the political economy of the United States with a focus on democracy, American federalism, labor unions, and statistical methods. In 2022, he published Laboratories Against Democracy. In this book, Dr. Grumbach shows how state governments over the past generation moved from the periphery to the center of American politics and policymaking with profound consequences for democracy. This book won the Merce Tate and Eleanor Ostrom Outstanding Book Award from the American Political Science Association and was selected as one of the New Yorker's best books. When he isn't writing award-winning books, Dr. Grumbach is the co-director of the Washington State Election Database, which is housed at the UW Center for the Study of Demography and Ecology. And finally, outside of academia, Jake describes himself as a nerd for classic funk, soul, and hip hop. Please welcome Dr. Jake Grumbach to the stage.
Hey, nice to see you all. I'm Jake Grumbach. Thanks so much to you all for coming, and thanks to Yvette Moy, who, as you guys know from other public lectures, has killed it in this position. I think this is her 23rd year, I believe. And just more to come, and I can't thank her enough for all she does in these public lectures. It's great to be back here. So thanks. Really great to be back at a UW-affiliated event, Go Dogs. After I left, when they saw that I left and they made the national championship. That's how it works, I guess. It's great to be here. Great to be back in Seattle. Came with some decent weather. And then finally, just great to be back. My subject of this talk is American democracy, and it's great to be back in a state that runs elections incredibly well. That's part of my research. This was not me saying it as somebody working at UW or living in the state of Washington at the time, but just really, when you measure this stuff statistically, accessibility of the ballot, the security of the ballot, and really innovating, leading ways to make, especially voter registration and casting your ballot more secure and accessible. Washington State, I'd say there's other leaders that were up there. Colorado and Oregon were also leaders, but Washington State really pioneered a lot of this stuff. So it's always great to come back here to talk about American democracy. Okay, so I'll get right into it. So the first thing I'd like to talk about, and the subject of my talk today, is, the horse race. So who's gonna win the soccer moms? Who's gonna win West Texas Latinos? Ha ha ha, just kidding, I hate the horse race. We're not talking about the horse race, we're not talking about polling. As you guys know, I study public policy and the political economy of the US, and that means I consistently argue that to understand what's going on in American politics, you can't look just, or really you shouldn't look really at all, at the horse race polling of how to message better, who's sending the most annoying text messages for donations, and who's leading in the national polls. And that's because even when we see a national polling estimate like this, public opinion and preferences in the American political system are refracted through political institutions, the constitutional rules of the US, which are actually quite quirky. And it means it's not some one-to-one relationship between what Americans think and want and what ends up happening in public policy. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today. Beyond the horse race, I'm going to be talking about public policy and really political institutions in the US, the rules of the game, and how those rules of the game in American politics refract and transmute and morph the preferences of ordinary Americans through voting and other ways of participating in politics into outcomes. And I think this is especially important because there is an ongoing crisis of American democracy, and we saw an explosive moment of that in January 6, 2021, where this photo was taken in the US Capitol building. And that this crisis is still ongoing, and that this crisis is not something like with American politics in general that you can understand through the horse race and watching cable news of who's leading and who's losing, or who's going to appeal to which constituency. We need to think about public policy and institutions, and in particular, the institutions related to American democracy, small d democracy, ruled by the people in the US. So what is democracy? Let me just define it really quickly before I get into the rest of this talk. So democracy and democratic theorists in political philosophy would, I would say, boil down democracy as a major political concept going back to ancient Greece and beyond into two major components. The first is civil rights and liberties, freedom from authoritarianism, rights and liberties of the individual, and the rule of law, peaceful transfer of power, and the law applied consistently across people, whether you're powerful or less powerful. That's the first element of democracy. The second element is political equality and majority rule. The idea that we are all equal people, we participate in politics, and our participation, mostly through the vote, is weighted equally, and that our votes are all equal in determining the outcome and what happens in public policy in our political system. Those two components are crucial, and those two components are under some strain in the contemporary period. There are two ongoing crises that are related, and I'm going to make a particular argument that they're deeply intertwined. So the first is the threat of a constitutional crisis, or really a coup or election subversion in a presidential election. We're pretty familiar with this one. The idea that a presidential candidate refuses to concede an election, maybe stokes or organizes a coup attempt in the national capital, right? Such that by the institutional rules, the rightful winner of the election does not end up in power afterward, or it develops into chaos and potentially even political violence. That's the first crisis, and that's a crisis that is potentially has some small, not large, but still too high of a chance of occurring in the 2024 presidential election. And the second crisis of American democracy is a crisis of minority rule, a crisis that we do not have political equality or one person, one vote, but that some political inputs are weighted much more heavily in determining outcomes in American politics than others. So we have two crises. One, the acute one we've seen a lot of news about over the past 4 years of potentially a stolen or subverted presidential election or an ongoing coup attempt. And the second being declining political equality, that we all count equally in our participation towards an outcome. So what I'm going to cover today is really making an argument that both of these crises, a crisis of the rule of law and a crisis of minority rule, both stem, ironically, from what I'm calling tyranny of the minority. All right, tyranny of the minority. I'll go into this in more depth shortly, but the point is that minority rule in the US, some voices being much louder in political institutions than others, as a function of decisions made hundreds of years ago in determining the constitutional structure of the US, are actually contributing to a crisis of minority rule and the decline of political equality, as well as increasing the potential for election subversion or a coup. I'm then going to talk, of course, last I gave some public lectures. The first public lecture I ever gave was on my book and was quite depressing about the state of political institutions, but the second lecture was uplifting what we can prospects for reform, so I'm going to try to combine both of those to create a modestly hopeful story in this talk. But you guys can keep me honest on that. Okay, as you guys know from your, high school classes in US history and American government, as you know from just being civically educated, as you know if you took poli-sci, Intro US Politics 101, the founders of the American constitutional system, the founders or framers or founding fathers, they were quite concerned with tyranny of the majority, the idea that populist majorities could run roughshod over individual rights and liberties and the rights of minorities, and through the support of a populist demagogue, large majorities could run roughshod over constitutional institutions and promote autocracy. They were very concerned about the passions of the masses. And we see this in this little cartoon here. 4 out of 5 citizens love democracy, and they're violating the individual rights and liberties of that gentleman who's crouched there, right? And the point there is that even James Madison, the founder, called the U.S. House, right, in the lower chamber of Congress, which is apportioned by population. So even at the time, in the late 18th century, the U.S. House was considered the populist part of American government and the American constitutional system. And Madison tries to sell the Constitution by saying, yeah, we want this majority rule institution, the U.S. House, based on population, one person, one vote. The majority of the U.S. House passes a law, but we also want something that's minoritarian, that pushes against the will of majorities, and that would be the U.S. Senate. And he called that the US House was the hot tea of the populist masses that was steaming, and the Senate was the cooling saucer that would cool down the hot passions of the masses, right? And this was at a time even before the US Senate was directly elected. That happened in the early 20th century. For the first 200 years of American governance, right, senators were actually appointed by state legislatures, right? So they were even a step farther away from voters, not to mention that they're not apportioned by population, but rather two per state. So the Senate was known as a minority rule institution, particularly for geographic minorities, small states, right? We tend to think, when we think of minorities, we think of racial minorities, gender minorities, sexual minorities, immigration-based minorities, linguistic, religious minorities, and so forth. What the founders really meant and how it plays out in practice are the founders were concerned about minorities where large property owners were a type of minority that needed protection, and really geographic minorities based in states. And currently we're seeing a bit of an uptick in public support for minority rule. So if you've ever heard somebody argue against majority rule institutions like the US House, or in favor of the Senate, or in favor of the Electoral College, minority empowering institutions, they'll often say, well, we don't want to be ruled by, on the left, we don't want to be ruled by the people who live in cities where most of the people are, right? We need to empower through institutions more rural people or people from smaller states, right? As opposed to empowering people as individuals with the same authority through electoral politics, weighting one person, one vote, okay? On the right here, there's increasing polling in addition that the argument goes that only people with true skin in the game, who are net taxpayers, that if you take away the benefits they get from the state and you add in the money they pay in taxes, only those net taxpayers or property owners should be allowed to vote. Usually the people arguing this, you see that it commands majority support in one political party's base as well, but even 25% of support among self-identified Democrats, right, that only people who are net taxpayers should have the right to vote. And this was a common argument in the Jim Crow era around self-governance and mass disenfranchisement in the South. But usually those people do forget that most people over 65 are net receivers of government benefits through Social Security and Medicaid, so ironically this would disenfranchise, retirees in the US, which people don't quite expect. But there is some growing support for minority rule institutions in the US. But not all support for these minority rule institutions that protect against majority rule is quite so noxious. So the founders actually, their concern with tyranny of the majority, the idea that populist majorities could run roughshod over the rights of minorities, that was actually decently well-founded in some cases, right? The US Constitution itself, for its time period, was way ahead of the game in establishing important individual rights that are not subject to majority rule, mostly in the Bill of Rights. So rights to speech, assembly, religious practice, and so forth. The idea that no majority can ban a religion in the US, right? Those sorts of things were actually had some pretty serious foresight to them, right? Same thing with the concern that a populist demagogue would whip up the passions of the masses and become a dictator. That was like a legitimate concern and actually very forward-thinking. To do that, protection of minorities, the founders went very aggressively to make it extremely hard to pass laws in the American political system if you are a member of the majority. If you and 65% of the rest of Americans support something, it's incredibly hard to make that happen through American government. There are many what are called veto points in the American constitutional system. A veto point is the sort of social science way of talking about some process in government that can block a law from happening. You guys already know where veto points are in the American constitutional system, right? You want to pass a national law, some sort of healthcare bill, some environmental bill, whatnot. You have to get past U.S. House majority rule, but then you have to get through the Senate. You have to get 60 senators because of the filibuster. You then have to have the president sign it and not veto it, right? You can have a veto-proof majority. Then you got to make sure the Supreme Court doesn't rule it unconstitutional. This is incredibly difficult, right? And empowers many minorities throughout the process to block something supported by American majorities of American citizens, right? But really, what has ended up happening was not the concern of the founders that populist majorities were threatening the American political system. Instead, throughout history, when minorities of any type, for example, racial minorities, have their rights trampled upon, or threats to the US political system in general, such as a coup attempt, those have not been populist majorities, but rather forms of minority interess threatening other minority rights and overpowering majorities. Ironically, those minority rule institutions empowered minorities to run roughshod over less powerful minorities and block majorities. So what I'm calling in this talk tyranny of the minority is actually what has ended up happening throughout American history and is kicked into really high gear in recent years due to a number of long-term trends. But just really quickly, if you read some of my work, you can read about the typical pattern of what happens when the rights of minorities are attacked in the US, such as the mass disenfranchisement of Black Americans in the South, right? The removal of Black voting rights in the South after Reconstruction, for example. The typical pattern is that the minority empowering institutions are the ones driving this attack on minority rights, and it is not the majoritarian institution of the US House, apportioned by population, doing it. Typically, the pattern of attacking minority rights goes: the Supreme Court, a minority rule institution appointed by the Senate, confirmed by the Senate, I should say, gives state governments more authority to restrict the rights or the voting rights, for example, in the case of Jim Crow of Black Americans in the South. State governments then decide whether to restrict democracy or the rights and liberties of various groups within them. And then Congress, the most majority rule institution within the American political system, decides whether to stop that or not, right? So I'll go through a few historical cases. First, ending Jim Crow, for example. We tend to think of this as potentially Jim Crow is a problem of Southern majorities running roughshod over Black civil rights in the South. But that's actually not what happened. It was actually minorities nationally, the Southern segregationist wing, even when the North became the large majority of the American population, had many more people than the South, had many more members of the US House then than the US South did because it had a larger population, and had anti-segregationist attitudes, particularly after the great migration of Black Americans to northern cities that built Black Seattle and the Bay Area, Los Angeles, Chicago, Detroit, New York, and so forth in the early and middle 20th century, right? This produced large anti-segregationist attitudes and moved northern congresspeople to oppose Jim Crow in the South. Why could this majority of the country not end Jim Crow into the South until an overwhelming force overpowered it through the civil rights movement? It was because of minority rule institutions like Southern senators who filibustered and blocked civil rights votes from appearing on the floor of the Senate. It was a minority of senators blocking what was a majority-supported set of civil rights reforms. And I would estimate, like, it's impossible to really say, but without the US Senate, a minority rule institution, civil rights in the South would have hit about 50 years earlier, if not before that, okay? This was not a case of tyranny of the majority, but rather tyranny of the minority. We actually see similar trends today. In the current Supreme Court, this is some analysis from a set of political scientists that I played a part in, but led by a scholar at Harvard, Maya Sen. And what this project did was, over now decades, track the public opinion of what American majorities want and what the Supreme Court ends up deciding, a minority rule institution of the Supreme Court. As of 2010, the Supreme Court was a little bit, so higher values on that y-axis. Sorry, I'm a quant. We got to nerd out on a tiny bit of stats. Again, sorry. Sue me. So there, the higher values are more conservative rulings or opinions. And there, the Supreme Court was a little bit more conservative in 2010 than the American public. When you ask the American public, majorities, what would you do if you had this case in front of you? Would you rule the Clean Power Plan unconstitutional that limited coal emissions or not, right? Then majorities of Americans say what they want, and then we test this against what the Supreme Court did. The Supreme Court was a little farther right than the American public. 2020, pretty similar. But in this new conservative supermajority, often appointed by presidents, nominated justices by presidents who didn't win the popular vote, right, is another way that minority rule enters the system into the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is incredibly out of step with the mass public of the US, right? And this is through minority rule institutions like the Electoral College that elects presidents who don't win the majority of voters in the US, not even, and then confirm justices who are confirmed by the Senate, a minority rule institution that is becoming increasingly minoritarian. In addition, so speaking of the Supreme Court, the recent Dobbs decision that you all know that allowed states to fully ban abortion was one of those rulings that went against majorities of Americans. About 65% of Americans opposed the Dobbs decision when you ask that. That's a supermajority, right? Seems, my majority rule would say that the Supreme Court would not do that, right? And then after the Supreme Court allowed states to ban abortion, myself and a political scientist, Chris Warshaw, who's a scholar of public opinion, we looked at state public opinion on abortion rights. Which states are going to get a post-Roe v. Wade policy, now that Roe v. Wade is gone, a post-Dobbs abortion policy that they agree with. And what we found is that a large number of states, all those states with estimates below 50%, do not have a majority of their own citizens that support their new post-Dobbs abortion policy, okay? What that means is that a substantial number of these abortion bans recently in the states are not supported by majorities of Americans, right? And again, if you think of reproductive rights as sort of a right of a key group in society, the rights of women, then this is, again, not majorities restricting those civil rights and liberties. This is a set of powerful minority interests doing so. And what we'd show even further is that gerrymandering, which you all know about, gerrymandering in some states, like Texas and a few others, gerrymandering has empowered an anti-abortion minority of voters to set the majority of the state legislature because they are geographically located in gerrymandered districts where their votes are more efficiently distributed and count more towards the state legislative majority. In other words, gerrymandering in a number of states has empowered an anti-abortion minority of voters to ban abortion by setting the majority of the state legislature, right? This gerrymandering has therefore been another tool to expand minority rule in the US. This is all facilitated by this quirky system of single-member congressional districts in the US, as opposed to what's called proportional representation around the world. So when I ask my students, why does the US have two political parties that are viable? They tend, my students are Gen Z, they're, sometimes activist-y types. They say, it's a conspiracy by the powers that be to keep the great politicians out, right? That's not exactly right. It's actually a function of the US Constitution that creates single-member congressional districts and has the Electoral College. It's basically basic math, but there's what's called a classic French sociologist, Duverger, coined Duverger's law. Duverger's law shows the pattern around the world that is essentially, if anything's a law in social science, this is probably a law. But countries that have a proportional representation system on the left have more than 2 viable parties. The US system and other single-member district systems, also called the plurality rule system, the first-past-the-post system, or the Westminster system. So other countries, they tend to be in the Anglosphere. The UK, Canada are great examples of this, have effectively 2 major political parties. Okay? Sometimes it looks like they have a third party, but it collapses back to 2. The reason why is sort of, I tried to draw out this diagram for you to illustrate this. In a proportional representation system, let's imagine we have a country, this green country, 45% of voters are members of the Conservative Party, C. 35% of voters are members of the Liberal Party, L. 20% of voters are members of the Green Party, G. Then they have a parliament. 45% of people in the country voted for the Conservative Party, and the Conservative Party gets 45% of the seats in Parliament. 35% voted for the Liberal Party, 35% of the seats in the Parliament are from the Liberal Party. 20% are from the Green Party, 20% of the seats are in the Green Party in the national legislature or Parliament. In the US, by contrast, there is no, in the US system, second place is the same as last place per district, okay? Second place is the same as last. In the proportional representation system there, getting second or third place, it still matters, right? You still get some seats in the legislature. In the US, we have voting by district, and this is really in our heads, like this is something very special, but many other countries do not organize legislatures this way. But in the US, let's imagine we had 3 districts, District A, District B, District C, with the exact same voting breakdown as that proportional system. 45% of each district votes for the Conservative Party, 35% vote for the Liberal Party, 20% for the Green Party. In this case, because the Party C won the most votes in each district, they get the seat for each district, right? It's the first past the post. And in this case, they get 100% of the seats in the legislature, rather than the 45% that reflects their national vote share, right? This is a major, major decision in the late 18th century to create single-member districts that, since then, has led to 2 major political parties. And as the parties polarized, as we are in now, much of the battles over what the parties do are in the nominations process, and in things like money in politics, lobbying, or doing other activism, and getting engaged in primary elections, which are often very obscure and off-cycle, right? There's very little you can do in the American political system right now by voting in a general election, particularly if you're in a solid red or solid blue part of the country, right? If you're not in a swing state, as you are not right now, sorry, but your vote is not all that important. It's very unlikely to affect the outcome, and it is extremely unlikely to threaten one of the major parties to change their policy agenda, right? To do that, you have to say, all right, I'm gonna donate in the primary for state legislature. This little faction, I have a policy issue that's not on the agenda. We're gonna do all this strategy. That's how it works in the US. In another country, you might say, I'm gonna switch my party from G to party Q, right? That tends to stand for what I believe in this particular case. It's very hard to do in the US system. And it means in the US system, money in politics is especially important as a way to get parties to change their policy agendas and policy priorities. So in a recent paper, and I just wanted to make sure to throw in this paper because it was one of the most fun I had doing a paper. But in this paper, we try to explain why the US has the oldest politicians of any country around the world, including any democracy, any dictatorship, any wealthy country, any poor country. The US, on average, a federal politician is about 60 years old on average, right? And the US actually has a relatively younger population than many of these countries that have much younger sets of politicians here. But it illustrates how money in politics really matters in shaping what parties do. And here what we did, myself and a colleague, Adam Bonica, is we did a bunch of statistical record linkage and statistical analysis to find the age of all sorts of participants in American politics. And the point here is that we found that half of all money in politics in the US system comes from donors aged 66 and over. Okay, very unrepresentative. So I always got to say, this is my disclaimer whenever I talk about this paper. Those older donors have incredible taste in music, and the younger people, I'm sorry, like, it's just not as good. However, I do think there should be more equal influence in American politics across age and all sorts. Everybody should have one person, one vote, and a pretty equal say in determining the outcomes of American politics, no matter your great or not so great taste in music. The big kahuna, though, of minority rule, beyond money in politics, beyond thinking about even potentially the Supreme Court, is currently Senate malapportionment. Senate malapportionment means what is the share of senators that you get compared to each state's share of the population. Senate malapportionment was already bad at the founding of the US, where the big state at the time, in the late 18th century, was Virginia. So Virginia and the Virginia plan for the Constitution was a much more majority rule constitution. The minority rule constitution was the New Jersey plan, named after the current small state at the time, New Jersey, of the original 13 colonies. Funny to think about that now. There's no big state, small. It was Virginia against small state New Jersey. They mixed those two plans to entice small states like New Jersey and big states like Virginia to endorse the Constitution. And part of that was creating the Senate that gives 2 senators per state. At the time, Virginia was considerably larger than New Jersey in population, so the Senate really did emphasize and accentuate the influence of New Jersey over Virginia. But it was nothing like current population distributions and the development of urban centers, where some states right now have such larger populations than small states that now we've reached a place where a voter in Wyoming is over 80 times more influential over the US Senate than a voter from California or New York. Here you see in this map how states, an average individual from a state, how much they affect the US Senate, right? And there you see Washington State. It's influenced, the influence of the average Washingtonian is about half of what it would be if the Senate was apportioned by population. You all are about half as influential over the Senate as you would in a system that equally counts everyone's votes in a one-person, one-vote system. And that's not even one of the bad situations. Like, being half as influential, that's too bad, but, you know, like, Seattle's about, almost 2 times the population of Wyoming is in urban Seattle, right? Then there's the rest of the state. But once you get to even larger states, or the coalition of small states that through the filibuster, if you get the 20 smallest states and their 40 senators, you can block nearly anything while you represent an incredibly small percentage of the population. And on climate reform, this is what has consistently happened, is that small states tend to be those that tend to be the greater homes of the coal and oil industry and have effectively blocked climate legislation that's supported by large majorities of Americans, but who tend to have less power in the Senate. And we see this statistically. In an analysis I quickly just did, in part for this talk, I find that now large shares of votes in the Senate are increasingly out of step with the desires of US majorities, right? So in some recent Congresses, the Senate, about 40% of the votes they take in the Senate, the winning side is out of step with majorities of the American public, of American citizens. That's pretty dramatic in enhancing minority rule, and it's not any particular minority you're thinking of. I have to keep re-emphasizing this. When I say minorities, do not think about racial minorities, religious minorities, linguistic, immigrant-based minorities. That is not what we're talking about here. If you happen to live in a small state, you are winning these votes in the Senate. by virtue of where you happen to live. If you live in a higher population state like Washington, you are not getting what you want out of the Senate. It's that simple, right? That is what minority rule is currently, is geographic minorities. Okay, so far I've discussed this straightforward result, which is that minority empowering institutions like the Senate and Supreme Court threatens political equality and majoritarianism, two key elements of democracy. Do majorities get what they want over minorities, right? If there's more people, if over 50% want something, you have a choice to make in a society, 55% want it, 45% say no, you should go with the 55%, seems fair. Another thing, political equality, that all of our votes count equally in determining what the country does. Both of those are violated by minority rule in the way that I've been discussing so far. But maybe the founders were right about, okay, we really do need to protect against majorities. Maybe that enhances some minority rule. But what about things like the threat of a coup or election subversion, the populist demagogue who riles up the masses to become a dictator, for example? The founders were really concerned about that. So maybe it's worth having these pro-minority rule institutions like the Senate and Supreme Court to stop that, potentially, right? Isn't that where populist majorities are really dangerous? So maybe we should have some minority rule? No. It turns out that it's powerful minorities, not majorities, who have threatened institutions and the rule of law in the US, that other concept of democracy, right? The rule of law, civil rights and liberties, freedom from authoritarianism. That has also not been at risk of majority tyranny, but rather tyranny of the minority. And I'm going to give a few historical and contemporary examples of that. The first is slavery and the Civil War, right? A time when the US South took up arms after the election of Abraham Lincoln by a majority, right? Abraham Lincoln and the more populist North have grown in their anti-slavery sentiment. They're not especially like pro-civil rights and racial equality, but they're anti-slavery. Right? The Republican Party has constituted itself in the North as an anti-slavery party, and they consistently win more votes. More people are in the North. They are anti-slavery, right? Lincoln then wins the election. Congress is already controlled by the anti-slavery Republicans in the same election, and the South knows this means Congress is going to ban slavery at some point soon, and the president will sign it. So they take up arms and start a civil war. Right? This was, again, a minority of the American society and political system doing something not through majority rule, but taking up arms in order to prevent majority rule from banning slavery in the South. This was another case where actually empowering majority rule institutions in the US, like the US House, would have actually ended slavery earlier. This is, again, not a case of tyranny of the majority, but tyranny of the minority. More recently, when the US came close to what's called election subversion, a subverted election is when something after votes are cast, there's some manipulation of vote tallies or election certification to fail to certify the rightful winner by the original institutional rules of that election and give power to someone else. That's election subversion. It can be related or in tandem with like a coup attempt, which is what we saw in the Capitol on January 6, 2021. But particularly, there was pressure on swing state election administrators, like in Georgia, to give electoral college votes to a candidate who did not win Georgia's electorate in the 2020 presidential election. And I gotta pause here to say, really credit to that Georgia state government and the Secretary of State's office and the election administrators who were Republican, like Brad Raffensperger and so forth. They did stand strong against pressure to find some votes, right, That was incredibly powerful elite sort of behavior in protecting the rule of law and political and democratic institutions in the US. And unfortunately, many of those really valiant Republicans were primaried out by voters after the fact, okay? But the point here is that this movement in favor of electoral subversion, in favor of coup attempts, that is also not a majority movement. The Stop the Steal movement, beliefs in mass electoral fraud that doesn't exist, and coup attempts are supported only by about 25% of the US public. That might seem like too much, maybe, but that's a minority of society, very much so. And around the world, my comparative politics colleagues, like some of this work with the author of How Democracies Die, is Dan Ziblatt, and he likes to say, this is also a pattern you see around the world. About a quarter of wealthy societies support authoritarianism and don't support small d democratic institutions or the idea that their political opponents are sort of legitimate opponents and that you should cede power if you lose elections. That is true around the world. But in the US came a bit closer to the brink of these institutions failing, in part because many political institutions in the US empower this particular 25% who are interested in threatening the rule of law. For example, this 25% holds outsized support in the US Senate because of small state bias and malapportionment. They hold a large share of Supreme Court justices, as you've seen in recent rulings that give presidents more authority, right? Federalism further, multi-level governance in the US and the fact that states regulate elections further makes it easier to subvert presidential elections because, again, you can just pressure one swing state government to throw the presidential election, and in a close election, that's enough, right? There's not a set of national election security regulators in the US that most other countries have. It's done at the state level, and one weak link in that chain can subvert an entire presidential election. And that's why one of my big pushes over the years is to have a national set of election regulators as well, so you don't just have to flip one purple swing state to give electoral college votes and subvert an election, but rather there's an entire national apparatus to protect the rule of law as well. One irony here is that things like January 6th have actually happened before, and political institutions have sometimes different ways of dealing with these things. So remarkably, it wasn't January 6th, it was February 6th, 1934 in France, not here. But at the time, there was a small authoritarian movement that attempted to overthrow Parliament on February 6th, 1934 in France. Remarkably similar minority committed set of minority coup attempters who wanted to overthrow the French Republic and install dictatorship at the time. This failed. The institutions, which did not empower minorities, particularly in that French system of the French Republic, that movement really died very quickly, and they did not return prominently to elections. Soon World War II happens, and Germans invade, and so forth, and Vichy government is installed. But at the time, in the French Republic, before that, this movement was squashed, and institutions did not re-empower a movement that did not want to cede power through elections, okay? And in the US case, minority rule institutions are increasing the risk not only of political inequality and declining majority rule, but also of things like a coup. So prospects for reform, so that was a little depressing so far, but let's get to how we're gonna fix this thing. So the prospects for reform, so thinking about the crises of democracy that are ongoing, threat of, trampling on individual rights and liberties and threats to the rule of law and peaceful transfer of power on the one hand, and threats to majority rule and political equality on the other. The goals here should be, first, to protect the rule of law, individual rights and liberties, and the peaceful transfer of power between elites. And the second is one person, one vote. Again, that we are all equal members of the US political system, and that when we cast a vote, it is counted equally. Our preferences are aggregated through this system equally, so our votes all count equally towards the outcome and determining what the US political system does. Some examples of those reforms, they feel like pie in the sky now, but if we don't talk about them, they will never happen. But things to establish one person, one vote in the US would be a legislature apportioned by population like the US House. I would add, if you want proportional representation, you can also create multi-member districts. There's no reason it's only one representative per district. You could have 2 or 3. A popular vote for president, you should not win executive office without winning a majority of voters. Legislative supremacy over judicial supremacy, right? That appointed judges, particularly when they're confirmed by the minority rule Senate, right? And potentially nominated by presidents who do not win the popular vote, right? Should certainly not have lifetime appointments, but should not have full judicial review and the ability to throw out any congressional legislation supported by a majority of the national legislature and majorities of Americans. And third, or fourth, I should say, coup attempts are sanctioned in some real way. That, I'm not a lawyer, I like to say, I'm no big city lawyer, I don't really know how that happens, but I don't know, there should be some disincentives for trying to do a coup. Proportional representation, what might that look like in the US system? Here, I'm going back to the founders and the party sort of breakdown at the time, before official political parties happened. We have the Federalist Coalition, the Anti-Federalist Coalition, and the Independents, right? And you see John Mercer down there, bottom right. What you can do is that you vote for one party, right? And those are the party nominees. Okay? And you have multiple choices there. This is a closed list proportional representation system. Another sort of movement towards this system that people like is ranked choice voting that may move the ball a little bit, but not particularly transformational. But proportional representation in a nationally polarized society like the current US, where different geographies have very different views and are deep red or deep blue, this would allow people to exert influence through a general election even when you're not satisfied with either party, okay? Through a general election here, you can vote for one of these parties because your vote goes into a national bucket, and even if your party does not win first place or even second place, they get the number of seats in Congress that are based in the amount of votes they got through the country, okay? Very different system than the two-party system created by single-member districts that we have today. The US Constitution is incredibly difficult to reform, so I just mentioned a bunch of institutional changes, like changing the rules of the US Constitution to create a more one-person, one-vote system and protect the rule of law. But how do you get to those pie-in-the-sky reforms? You have to build political capacity. One is through generational change, and in part, I study youth political participation and voting. This is the turnout rate of Americans under 30 in midterm elections recently. 20%, 21%, 31%, 27%. Does that, just a quick gauge, does 27% turnout of people under 30, does that sound like high or low? Yeah, it's actually the second high. 2018 and 2022 are the two highest turnout midterms for people under 30s since the Watergate era, right? Since music was incredible. So this is actually a big deal. Like, the American youth are not as apathetic as we may think, and this is growing, but this is also facilitated by changes to voter registration policies. So some of my most important statistical research is on the effect of same-day voter registration, again, Washington State a leader there, automatic voter registration, and vote by mail, but especially those registration reforms, automatic and same-day registration, have very substantial effects, mostly on youth turnout. So there's nothing to be done. States can change this, and Washington State's really been a leader on this. It's also just easier for state governments to manage when people are automatically registered to vote, for example, through moving and engaging with the DMV in some way, updating your car registration and so forth. This has been meaningful. Washington State, and even more specifically King County, have tried to make money in politics more equitable and accessible, for example, through the Democracy Voucher Program happening in King County in local elections, where each person, it's a little bit of a confusing system, but you get a small credit that you can distribute to local candidates, and local candidates who get these Democracy Voucher credits, they pledge to not take other outside big money in politics. That has enhanced a little bit sort of representation by age and social class in the money in politics system, at least in a place like King County. So there are things to be done. And young people, again, not loving the music, but they're getting much more engaged in politics than I would have expected. A second, and I've talked about this at earlier public lectures, another line of my research is on the role of the US labor movement in democratic institutions. So we think of the labor movement typically as, a force for, wages and benefits for their members and things like that. But actually, the labor movement was very central to the democratization of the US, creating the US as a full democracy, which did not happen until the enforcement of the Voting Rights Act in 1965 and the end of mass disenfranchisement of Black Americans in the South, not to mention prior to that, the constitutional amendment to grant the franchise to women in the earlier 20th century. But actually, the labor movement was quite central to this democratization wave in the US. Here, I like to show this 1963 article that showed that actually the Birmingham marchers, who Bull Connor sent his fire hoses in the most famous Ken Burns sort of civil rights era iconography of attack dogs and fire hoses happening on peaceful civil rights activists and marchers in Birmingham, Alabama, the people who bailed that set of activists and marchers out of jail in Birmingham, Alabama was the United Auto Workers. And there in this picture there is the head of the United Auto Workers at the time, Walter Reuther, standing in the front of the March for Freedom in Detroit in 1963, and he's also behind the scenes on the March on Washington, sort of patting Martin Luther King on the back as he goes out for the I Have a Dream speech. But this is true of the Black labor movement and A. Philip Randolph and the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. This is true of majority white unions like the UAW or the Congress of Industrial Organizations, CIO, which eventually merged with the AFL, that actually labor was very central, including labor unions with growing, especially diverse member bases, but including like very majority white unions, saw in their interest the idea of establishing universal voting rights in the US as something that would help the labor movement. So they saw this as strategically in the labor movement's interest to have a full democracy in the US. And that's actually still happening a little bit today. And as Martin Luther King has this great quote, I like to say, the coalition that can have the greatest impact in the struggle for human dignity here in America is that of the Negro and the forces of labor, because their fortunes are so closely intertwined. And here, Martin Luther King is marching with striking chemical workers, and he, of course, dies marching with striking sanitation workers in Memphis, Tennessee. So I think both youth participation, the labor movement, plus just engagement and activism by people who are newly interested in the democratic institutions of the US, right? So for the most part, we don't care much about the rules of the game. We care about what outcomes they produce. But in the US, the rules of the game really matter, and we're seeing increased interest, including by folks like you who come, take a weekday evening to learn about US constitutional institutions and majority rule and the rule of law and things like that. So thanks for nerding out with me. So to review, I'm arguing that both crises of American democracy, a crisis of weakening majoritarianism and growing political inequality, as well as acute threats to national institutions and the rule of law, both stem from tyranny of the minority and minority-enhancing institutions in the US. There are prospects for institutional reform that will take many, many years, but settle in. I think it's worth it, and I think we can do it. As Yvette mentioned, this is my book. Thanks so much for your time. I hope I left enough for Q&A, but I always run a little over, so apologies. Thanks.
Hi, thank you. I welcome everyone to come up to the mic that has questions, or you can send them in through Slido. We have a couple on Slido already. So we'll start with, you mentioned coups and election subversion. What are your thoughts when a party spends tens of millions of dollars to remove third-party candidates from ballots?
That's right. So major parties do have interests. So there's frequently in the US system litigation over who appears on ballots. And we actually have, there's prominent and contentious litigation on appearing on the ballot to the major party candidates, right? If you guys have seen the news, there's lawsuits to try to get Kamala Harris off the ballot and say that her nomination was too late in the game and that Joe Biden should remain on the ballot. There's Republican litigation there. And there's Democratic Party litigation to get Donald Trump off the ballot as well. But also, the parties do spend money to try to keep third-party candidates off the ballot as well, especially when they think they'll funnel off some of their electoral bases. I would say that shows the interests of the major parties in reducing voting for third parties that they think will take away votes from them. But the major force in keeping third parties not viable in the US is not those sources of litigation or activity by the two major parties. Rather, it's single-member districts and the Electoral College. This is a perfect relationship around the world. If you want to see parties, or multiple parties beyond two, just look to systems like the Netherlands, all over Northern and Central Europe, right? Proportional representation systems have 5 viable parties consistently, or more. In the US system and Westminster systems, they create 2 parties no matter how hard or not hard the major parties fight against third parties.
Okay, so a couple of things. One is, I'm really sorry you didn't show Alaska on that pic map, because that would have been extremely funny. And it does comfort me that Bernie is so powerful, because if you looked at the size of Vermont,
that was funny, nice one.
It's like those little things that make it better, okay? Then we are a republic, and unfortunately, no one wants to say that. We were designed as a republic, and we are going to continue to be a republic until things change, which may never happen, sadly enough. And finally, telling Western Washington people what you're telling is sort of like preaching to the choir, as it said. Have this talk at, the University of North Dakota.
Absolutely.
Or Brigham Young.
No, that's right.
Okay? And
just got back from the University of Houston, which I did really enjoy.
Well, except Houston is blue.
Houston's very different, but at the econ department of University of Houston, you'd be, or maybe you wouldn't be surprised.
So the thing is, this talk doesn't, I think it's great you're doing it. I know why you're doing it. But the big thing is, I'll finalize with this. Telling us this isn't going to change things.
That's fine. So I would say the first thing I'll say, I'll do this reverse order. Those are great comments and questions. Thank you. The first is in reverse order. So my task is, I am a social scientist rather than an activist with this, where I'm saying what I think in many of these cases and these concepts around democracy. But for the most part, this is about analysis of if we have these concepts of democracy over time, like what has trended and how influential are different sources of political inputs in setting outcomes in the US. And I welcome anybody to take whatever normative or like positive or negative valence they think about that. But it is true that one person, one vote has weakened over time through, for example, Senate malapportionment. I would also say, so the republic versus we're a republic, not a democracy. This I hear very frequently. So the historians are very clear on this, and going back to the original founders, those were synonyms at the time incredibly clearly. And we can call it, like the technical term for the US is either a small d, small r, democratic republic, or republican democracy. And there was some notion at the time, one distinction was that republicanism was about representative democracy rather than direct democracy. We're not going to vote directly on the laws as voters, we're going to vote on representatives. That was republicanism. So there's nothing about the founders talking about this is a republic that prevents one person, one vote, right? Rather, these terms, right now, I do think it's okay, like if I like talking about these institutions, because like we talked about now, let's just put it out. Whoops, I'm trying to show more, go back to that slide where people support minority rule. But I just think we should bring it out into the fore and say, okay, if you support, for example, non-one person, one vote based institutions, we are saying, let's count somebody in a state like South Dakota as more influential, their vote as more influential, as them as a bigger and more important political citizen of the US than somebody who lives in a different state. That's what we're saying, and people can take it or leave it. But that is what we're saying, you know? Thank you so much for the questions and comments. Yeah.
I have a proposal for you as a research and your team. Instead of electoral college, why don't we combine the 50 United States into 5 regions, East, West, South, North, and Central, with 10 states in each region. And then, once you vote on that, you have proportional vote for popular vote rather than electoral vote. And then you select the president every 4 years. That will cut down the time, effort, money, and headache for so many people who don't understand the difference between electoral vote and popular vote, because most of the democracies in the world use popular vote.
Right. All of them do for their executives. This is the only country with something like the Electoral College for the executive. And I would say interestingly, so the Electoral College does not, it empowers small states somewhat, but the bigger effect of the Electoral College is it empowers swing states and means much of the campaign resources go to swing states. So it is funny, like, you know, I recently gave a talk in Pennsylvania and it was like, damn, the ads, if you think the text messages you're getting are crazy, it's like, that place is wall-to-wall political spending, right? And that's exactly the opposite of what the founders wanted. They said the Electoral College will incentivize presidential candidates to go all around the country and talk to everybody and not just focus on big populous Virginia. That's what they thought. It's literally the opposite, where now they go to Ohio 80 trillion times and that's about it, right? So it's not a system that really benefits anybody except these swing states, right? And the real thing that will end the Electoral College is when both parties win the Electoral College and lose the popular vote. Then both parties have an incentive to stop it. Right now there's been a pattern where one party has been the one to, the few times, happen to win the Electoral College and not the popular vote, so that party sees the Electoral College as an advantage for it, right? The way to produce consensus around new rules is to make both parties win, live or die on that same system. I would say the thing to look out for is popular vote pacts among states, where states have pledged, groups of states pledge, we're going to give our Electoral College votes to the winner of the national popular vote, as long as enough other states do it at the same time. So it's like a pact, okay? There is some movement on that. I don't know how well it's doing, but they're really pushing Michigan's state government to sign on to this now, but we'll see what happens with that. Great question.
Okay, I'm going to combine 2 of the questions. Regarding the tyranny of minority via the Supreme Court, what are some potential plans for the Supreme Court reforming besides court packing? And do you think we should pass term limits to the Supreme Court? And if so, what should they be?
Yeah, so I think term limits actually do a huge amount to make the Supreme Court more responsive to majorities of Americans. And what term limits do is it means not by sort of accidents of the timings of retirements and deaths determine huge, many decades worth of Supreme Court control, especially in this polarized era. This is a different era where now you can predict how Supreme Court justices will rule based on who nominates them. Decades ago, this was not the case, and actually some Supreme Court justices really faked out their nominators. It's very interesting, right? Supreme Court justices nominated by very conservative presidents became some of the liberals and vice versa, right? This doesn't really happen anymore and increases the importance of things like term limits. And I will just say also for Ruth Bader Ginsburg's decision to not retire, we estimated with this group, that set back this conservative majority on the Supreme Court will last about 30 years longer precisely because of Ruth Bader Ginsburg's decision to not retire and untimely death at the time. And that's just seems a bit overly consequential for one person's like decision to retire and the timing of their death, right? To set 30 years of one of the branches of government, that is a huge, huge deal, right?
It doesn't matter if you are a person who favors the current Democratic nominee or if you're a person who favors the current Republican nominee, you are convinced that fully half of the country is totally crazy. So I wonder if you can parse for me and explain a bit of why we have half of the country totally crazy.
What a great, I love the framing of that question. At first I was confused, where are we going with this? But that's exactly right. We're in a heavily polarized situation, particularly of affective polarization, dislike of the out party. People's dislike of the other party tends to be stronger than their love of their own party. And this, unfortunately, like another challenge in the political system is that this is not really based in as much public policy conflict, rather the culture war and conflict over the direction of the country in the culture war and sort of merging sort of cultural liberalism and conservatism. That's a lot harder to govern over. That's a lot less about public policy and a lot harder to get consensus on. So we're in a difficult age. I started this talk saying, I don't do this sort of attitudinal behavior-based research. I think we really need to think about public policy and institutions because everybody is justified for your own political preferences and attitudes. Like in developing a political system, this is what I really want to say. You guys get glimpses of like issues I care about in politics and policy. I'm a normal human being, right? With a political philosophy. But what I'm trying to say here is how do we construct a society that aggregates everybody's preferences into an outcome that is fair and just for all, right? That is the point. And it's great, like I said here, going back to thinking about abortion bans in the states, in a state like Arkansas, right, or Oklahoma, their strong restrictions and near bans on abortion are responsive to what their populations want. The challenge I'm talking about is a state like Texas that does not have majority support for an abortion ban, but the state legislature is empowered by a gerrymandered minority of voters to ban abortion, right? That is what I'm saying is the challenge, is when ordinary Americans are not treated equally in the political system and their preferences are not equally weighted in determining outcomes, whatever those preferences are. That's about building a political system that's responsive to the citizenry. That is what small d democracy or small r Republican democracy, democratic republicanism, and so forth really means. So abstracting away, I like to play hits that I tend to particularly care about, right? In this case, reproductive rights or something. But really, we can talk about this with respect to any issue. It's about creating a political system that aggregates preferences into outcomes that respond to what most people want. How do we solve sort of affective polarization? That's a great question. I think we should try, to be patient with each other. We should try to get off social media. I don't know. It's a tough one.
So I was wondering if you could go,
What's
first of all,
up,
hi.
Ewan?
For those that don't know, I'm one of Grumbach's former students back when he was a
Thanks
UW.
so much for coming, Ewan. Very nice to see you.
I'll be honest, I may have skipped class to be here, but
It's terrible.
in my defense,
I take all I said back about youth participation is back.
In my defense, I would not be a teacher without a prospective teacher without you. But I was wondering if you could go more into depth into the role of the labor movement in the combating of the tyranny of the minority. That was a fascinating part of your intro to labor class, and I was just wondering if you could go into a bit more detail into that.
Thanks, Ewan. Great to see you. So labor movement. So I would just say, historically, we have these elements where labor, organized labor, really unemphasized history in the U.S. and in thinking about in contemporary sort of understandings, we tend to think, okay, there's sort of like race and civil rights over here, and there's labor over here. Or there's rights around identity over here and rights around class over here, right? But these are deeply intertwined, as we know, and the labor movement historically played a key role in many countries around the world that had their first experiments with democracy or republicanism in the 19th century, so after the US. Labor movements were very central to the creation of those democracies, And those labor movements created labor parties. In the US, the first move towards democracy was before labor unions were a thing, late 19th century. So this was not a labor-based American Revolution, which did expand democracy in the US, a very narrow form, right? But that was a big move towards democracy. But those 19th century movements around the world really did. But beyond that, today I have some research on organized labor and racial solidarity, that if you join a union, through organized labor's efforts around sort of union education and things like that, unions produce racial solidarity across workers. Unions also, I think, part of this is very hard to test statistically, but unions also connect people to public policy in ways that are negotiable over public policy, rather than the scorched earth culture war, where it's basically like there's no way to negotiate in a culture war, basically. But you can negotiate over wages, benefits, healthcare, and so forth. You can take half a loaf. There's no half a loaf of my country is slipping away. Like that's not a thing. There's no half a loaf of like Haitian migrants in Ohio. That's not a thing, right? So labor unions could be some sort of move a bit of political attention away from the culture war towards public policy, things government can actually do to make people's lives better, both materially or, on things around culture and identity, we connect to public policy. I would say those are potential reasons, but, you and I would like to, you're the type of person to think about as you go out in the workforce, sort of what you're seeing, and do these theories like have real world application in the what you're seeing out there. I would love to know more. Statistically, we see it a little bit. Thanks, Ewan.
Okay. My question was actually going further on into like the labor movement.
Cool.
You say how the labor movement was this force against in politics, but I've seen more recently that we might be going to like a post-material society in which the political interests of the masses comes down to personal identity choices rather than material conditions. In this country, we have seen poor people and rich people on one side, and then rich people and poor people on another side, in which the divides, the class divides, are no longer about like personal upbringing or about the jobs you take, but like where you come from and your personal beliefs. Do you believe that this is a continuing trend, and then how would this change American politics?
Very nice. You sound like you've been doing poli-sci. Good for you. That's really, I think that's great. Both parties now are cross-class coalitions, right? They look a bit different, but the Democratic Party coalition is like the urban professional managerial class as well as the urban working class and poor. And the Republican Party is a coalition between some major industries around low-wage service employers and extractive industry, as well as the mostly white working class and to some extent Latino working class, more rural voters as well. But those are both cross-class coalitions. That's a really interesting moment. That's different than the much more class-based politics of over 50 years ago, where the parties tended to be the business party and the sort of more working class labor party, right? So both parties are cross-class coalitions, but their economic agendas are very different. The point, though, that you're exactly right on is few people currently vote based on those economic policy agendas. Most people vote on issues of rights, identity, culture, and those are critically important and interact with material realities. Like, let's be real, like, I'm talking about reproductive rights. These are people's lives and material realities. Immigrants and immigration is a huge thing. Immigration economically has a positive effect on native-born wages and employment, I should say, so it's not an economic threat. But immigrants themselves and how societies change with new groups that bring different cultures. Like, these are people's real lives. But I would just say that is true, that will continue to dominate mass politics for a while. But one thing I think we can do, people, like I said, in a democracy, people prefer what they prefer, and everybody's equally valuable, even if I think their political preferences are so gross. They are equally valuable in the political system and deserve equal voice to me or you or anyone. That is the point. What can we do in terms of policy and institutions to make sure that people's rights and liberties are not trampled over, right? We can do things like shape institutions, have incentives for media firms to not stoke conspiratorial things or promote hatred. We can have, we can have incentives in sort of the profit systems to avoid sort of social media that promotes various like grifting on conflict. We can promote systems of one person, one vote, so people feel more efficacious in politics. Like you're not stuck in a deep red or deep blue place where your vote doesn't really matter. You can feel like, a proportional representation, multi-party system, I think, would give people like the ability to feel like your vote in a general election like moves the ball on something, right? All of those together are policy and institutional ways of bringing people together from where they're at, right? Rather than, I think, the solutions that are not solutions to the culture war are to say, we'll re-educate people, we'll kill all the misinformation, we'll go into people's brains and message the right way that actually, love your neighbor. Like, that's not gonna work. We have to think about policy and institutions of how to generate more consensus and less conflict.
Do you think the Founding Fathers paid any consideration at all to the tyranny of the minority, the idea that that might happen? Because you talked a lot about how the tyranny of the majority, how they paid a lot of attention to that sort of idea, but do you think the opposite might have been true?
No, and I think it's not their fault. Like, this is a thing where the founders were really brilliant, had a lot of like things they did anticipate. Like, I do think they're concerned about tyranny of the majority and protection through the Bill of Rights, of civil rights and basic civil liberties at the time. They thought of like citizenry not being for, certainly not for enslaved people or native peoples, not women, often not property-owning white men even. But even so, even for a limited swath of the population, like this was the best of the world at the time. You know what I'm saying? Like this really moved the ball, and we do need to be real about that. And also the limitations, but they were incredibly concerned about essentially like British monarchy that could run roughshod over individual rights and liberties, and they worried about populist masses voting for somebody like that. They wanted to prevent that. It turned out that was not much of a risk historically. Like, that has not been the case. Even when there's been presidential candidates who want to run roughshod over minority rights and liberties, over the Bill of Rights and the Constitution, become autocrats, they're supported by a minority of Americans. There's not been a majority upswell for dictatorship in the US. So they did not anticipate that. They were incredibly concerned about populism, in a bit overboard, and it turned out they kind of overshot protecting minorities in that way, ironically, which further harms other less powerful minorities as well as majorities in the American political system. But they were really ahead of the game. Like, I do want to say that, not great people in a lot of ways. Many of them owned slaves. Many of them also did articulate for the time a political philosophy and a concern about autocracy that was very ahead of the game as well.
Thank you so much, Jake. I'm going to end us by combining two more questions from the Slido online. Do we have more urgency or incentive to make changes to the structure of our representational selection, since this is, and I love this, the era of variable truth availability via social media?
What a great question.
And combine that with, what is the best hip-hop album ever?
What is the best hip-hop album ever? Damn. All right, I'll start with that one. I would say, a lot of people, like hip-hop heads often say Nas's Illmatic is like the perfect album. It was very short, 1994, out of Queens, New York, Nas. That's kind of like a canonical answer, but I would say, I don't know, for me, like, I would say an underemphasized one, Outkast's Aquemini, their third album, is maybe like, I think a slept-on genius one. Great. In the age of social media, so I would say it's just critically important, I think. An orientation I have as a scholar is to say, we're going about our daily lives. You guys are the exception. Most people are not that into politics, right? Don't have time, capacity, just interest like you all do in politics. And we need to think about building institutions that take people where they're at and put their preferences into some bucket and determine an outcome based on what people prefer, right? And one person, one vote, majority rule is the most basic way to do that, right? So I would say, like, the question about social media is very good because it doesn't say, okay, like, we can reverse engineer everybody's brains and so forth. We have to think about how social media develops and around how this technology develops. So right now there are a great set of econ studies that I'm like interested in and sort of get into a bit, but it's about, you can exploit, for example, when a high school bans smartphones during the school day, you can see what ends up happening. And I would say it's not everything is the use of smartphones, but there was a new one that just showed like on every mental health and educational outcome too, like how damaging this technology has ended up being. And I'm addicted to my smartphone, so I'm allowed to say this. But there, like, we do have to think about, institutions and rules where we can coordinate and not rely on the individual with this powerfully addictive, like, all knowledge right in front of you in blue light. It's really hard to imagine that we as individuals are so personally responsible. I can't put them away. Like, I think of myself as, like, decently strong-willed, and I cannot do this. But we come up with, like, collective solutions around institutions, like schools, workplaces, and things like that, that reduce our use of these technologies, particularly social media being the biggest dopamine hit of all of them. Besides my iPhone games, everybody that knows me knows I gotta get off these damn iPhone games. Thank you very much for that last question.
Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Jake. Thank you so much.
Thank you, really appreciate it.
And please remember to vote.
Yeah, go vote, yeah. Go vote, go dogs.